when people think I Heart Alberta Beef, they think about ranchers and they think about eating beef, and the people who get that beef from those ranchers to your table are made completely invisible by that resource pride.
Makes no difference where I go, you're the best hometown I know. Hello, Calgary.
The Alberta Advantage is supported by listeners like you. Independent, listener-supported media like this podcast is possible only thanks to the generous support of our listeners. If you think what we do is important, please head over to patreon.com/Alberta Advantage and support our work with a monthly donation.
Calgary, you know we love you.
Hello and welcome to the Alberta Advantage. I'm your host, Kate Jacobson, and on Team Advantage today we have Will.
Hello.
Joel.
Hello, hello.
And Patrick.
Hi there.
Today we'll be talking about yet another truly awful situation ripped from the headlines that turns out to be not only more fucked up than we could have possibly imagined when we look at its history, but also yet another example of something that was pioneered in Alberta. And folks, I regret to inform you that we will be talking about the meatpacking industry on today's episode. You may have heard Alberta meatpacking plants noted in the news recently as having the largest industrial site outbreaks of COVID-19 in North America, with 1,500 cases and 3 deaths linked to Cargill's High River, Alberta plant, and 1,046 cases and 2 deaths confirmed in Brooks, Alberta, where an outbreak at a JBS Foods plant contributed 600 confirmed and probable cases, and one of the deaths included a worker. About 7% of the city of Brooks, population 15,000, has contracted the virus. And not reassuring in the slightest is the fact that the 2 giant plants with record outbreaks make up 70% of Canada's beef processing capacities. So we're going to be looking at, how did this truly outrageous situation come to be? Why is so much beef processed in Alberta by transnational corporations with terrible reputations? Who does the work, and who wants to make sure nothing in this industry changes, even if current conditions are literally costing workers' lives? We'll be looking at the shift from the family farm to global agribusiness, the impacts of this shift on rural Alberta communities, strikes and unionization in the industry, Jason Kenney, because of course you knew he had to be in the middle of this, and his key role in developing the temporary foreign worker program. And we'll also be looking at Cargill and JBS as they exist today. Plus, we'll share some of our thoughts on what can be done going forward and recommend organizations that are supporting workers through a truly appalling crisis.
So it may be somewhat surprising to us now, but up until the late 1980s, meat processing consisted of smaller Canadian-owned plants distributed across the country in major cities. These became the sites of pitched labor struggles. The Gainer strike in the summer of 1986 in Edmonton is one such example.
This morning, things appeared calm, but there was an underlying current of anger. Anger at statements attributed to Gainer's owner Peter Pocklington, particularly the comment that he would never have the union back in his plant.
If the union will never get back in, then nobody else will either.
Several hundred angry workers have been manning the picket lines at the 3 entrances to Gainer since the strike began Sunday. The line held firm at the main gates when the lead bus in a convoy of 4 tried first to inch its way through the picket line and then accelerated for a few feet, knocking some picketers to the ground. By that time, the strikers had started to smash out the windshield. 10 minutes after the bus tried to crash the picket line, it backed up and pulled away with the other 3 buses following.
So the Gainer strike started on June 1st in 1986 in Edmonton. It lasted 6.5 months with 1,080 workers and was one of the most violent strikes in modern Alberta history. The Gainer's plant was owned by Peter Pocklington, owner of the Edmonton Oilers.
And I just want to say, Peter Pocklington, you have the name of a villain from a children's book where the hero is a small bunny rabbit who has 2 brothers.
Yeah, there's a very good mustache twirling energy to the name Peter Pocklington. Mm-hmm. Previously, there was a national pattern for meatpacking bargaining in 1984. However, in the face of a, quote, struggling industry, unquote, Pocklington demanded concessions from workers, including dropping the starting rate from $12.99 an hour to $7 and freezing the base wage after dropping it from $14.99 to $11.99. UFCW 280p protested, only to be met with strikebreakers lining up outside the plant. UFCW was intimidated into making concessions. Sick pay was slashed. Health benefits were slashed or taken away. Lost holiday hours. An extended probationary period was implemented, and a 2-tier wage system was established.
And what a national pattern for bargaining means is that means that collective agreements are being negotiated across the country or across the province with oftentimes small wins or small increases. And then all of the employers in that given industry are basically following the pattern set by that initial contract. This is really, really common even today across employers, and it's really rare. And almost it's explicitly evil. What Pocklington did is to buck the trend of this national pattern bargaining for concessions is rare and is absolutely, a tactic of union busting.
So the concessions made in 1984, the denigration of these workers' pay and benefits kind of set the groundwork for what the strike that happened in 1986 when they went on strike essentially to return to the national pattern and called for parity with Canada Packers. So as was mentioned, these strikes were tumultuous to say the least. On the first day of strikes, there were massive picket lines and tremendous solidarity. Not one meat packer crossed the picket line, which successfully blocked strike breakers and livestock from entering the plant. Things got more violent from there on out, though. The second day of striking, the police showed up to clear the way. In the first 11 days, over 300 people were arrested. And after that, state repression continued with the first ever deployment of Edmonton's riot squad. In early June, an entire third of the police force was being used for escorting strikebreakers. And you can imagine that this was extremely expensive. The entire police department's annual budget for overtime, which was $500,000, was used in the first month of repressing these strikes. There was also court injunctions that aimed to limit the gathering of people and to suppress the strikes. After that, with options starting to be limited, there was a successful boycott campaign that was done in collaboration with unions across the country. And then after months of failing to resolve the labor dispute through the courts, under pressure from the then Premier Getty, and with a help from a bribe from the government in the form of a $65 million loan, which Pocklington defaulted on a mere 2 years later, a reluctant Pocklington agreed to negotiate with the union with mediation from the Premier. And while the reception to the agreement was mixed, it nevertheless reinstated people's pensions and kept the union, which Pocklington was trying very hard to get rid of.
It was a really remarkable moment in Alberta labor history, and there is a really wonderful documentary about it that I do really recommend watching if you're more interested. But one of my favorite moments from that strike and from that picket line is they actually received a lot of support from Edmonton's Catholic community, including, if I'm recalling this correctly, some local monks coming up to the picket line and dragging big wooden crosses back and forth in front of the gates to stop a bus full of scabs from getting into the plant, which is a really remarkable scene.
That's fucking cool as hell.
I mean, as far as monks go, yeah, great stuff from the monks,
Catholics,
I gotta say.
they're good now.
Yeah, so the gainers didn't make an offer to workers for 6 months, so it took until December for a strike that started in the summer. In 1989, the provincial government took over the plant due to Pocklington's failure, but to repay his loans that he had taken out. It was sold to Burns Meats in 1994, absorbed by Maple Leaf in 1996, and then shut down after another strike in 1997. Some 850 workers lost their jobs. Plants in both Calgary and Edmonton were shut down within this same decade, and operations moved away from urban centers to rural Alberta.
And this is a really important factor to consider when we ask ourselves, why are these huge meatpacking plants now in rural Alberta? Like, why are the meatpacking plants that are in Brooks and High River in those places and not in Calgary or Edmonton, which have, much larger labor forces? And part of it is relocating and reorganizing in a way that avoids the labor costs, which were associated with these plants being in major industrial centers.
Yeah, and this goes hand in hand with a whole bunch of other changes that were occurring in the agricultural sector generally. So before looking at meatpacking in depth, we should look at the rest of the supply chain as well. Changes were happening in meatpacking went hand in hand with what was happening in agriculture. The last 2 decades of the 20th century saw significant transformation of agriculture in the prairie provinces. The family farm was increasingly being superseded by multinational corporations such as Cargill within the Canadian food system. And this transformation was the result of political decisions by governments to dismantle protections for small farms in favor of the big players. And the free trade agreements that usually went along with those subjected farmers to global competition. Basically, this was like neoliberalism goes to rural Alberta, neoliberalism goes to the agricultural sector. So this had enormous negative impacts on the viability of the rural prairies, contributing to an accelerated decline, in some cases even like rural depopulation. Hog farming is a good example of how this change played out. The federal government's wind down and an elimination of the crow rate, which subsidized grain transport by rail until 1995, forced farmers to search for new products with better margins, such as livestock. Specifically, it created a large pool of cheap animal feed grain that wasn't economical to export anymore.
And what happened is during the 1990s, you get the emergence of these really intensive livestock operations that are often called mega barns. And basically what this means is whereas, a family farm might produce several hundred hogs a year, these corporate-owned farms could produce hundreds of thousands of animals for slaughter. And furthermore, these operations became very vertically integrated, so that a single company would control the entire barley to bacon pipeline, because we sure as shit love pipelines in Alberta, which means that a single company might own feedstock inputs, the hog farms themselves, and the processing plants and the wholesalers. So I think there's a really interesting parallel here with how the oil industry in Alberta becomes extremely vertically integrated at this time, and since its inception, and how this same dynamic plays out with hog farming. And, these are enormous companies. They often have revenues in the billions. They have an international scale. And this type of vertical integration makes it extremely difficult for family producers to compete against them. And this expansion of hog production basically contributed to a 1998 price crash that ruined many family farms.
Yeah, just like there's lots of detail we could go into here, but it's basically just the fact that the scale of these operations are so huge, and the control of these companies over like all of the inputs and all of the various like stages of the commodity chain as it goes from inputs to actually like growing hogs or whatever, to slaughter, to processing, to being sold. When you have a single entity that can control that whole chain, it really puts, your family farmer or anybody who's attempting family farming at a severe disadvantage. At best, they can kind of just provide some sort of inputs to this giant corporate machine somewhere. It's very unlikely that they're going to be able to compete from a price point of view, right?
When we think of competition in a marketplace, we typically think of like the cost of whatever the product is that's on the shelf. But the central insight that these mega meat manufacturing corporations had is that a lot of profit can be made on the supply side of it as well. So this entire consolidation, this entire efficiency maneuver that occurs over these last 2 decades in the last century, it's all about squeezing the cost of labor and also squeezing the cost or the price of the raw inputs, the feed and the cattle that go into the system. And that's where a huge amount of the profits are then able to be captured in this industry.
And obviously, this is not very good, for our society, because there's been a lot of studies and they've shown that, small producers, they spend significantly more in local areas and they hire a lot more people, while corporate farms are engineered to extract wealth, out of rural communities and into shareholder pockets. And I don't mean to do like glorification of small businesses or the family farm or anything like that. But the truth is that working conditions on these corporate farms were usually substantially worse. And it's exacerbated by the aforementioned glorification of small businesses in the family farm, because these labor law exemptions that were maybe originally in a very charitable interpretation meant for family farms get extended to these really, really giant corporate agribusiness, which is also a huge, massive source of pollution, primarily in the form of manure. And that's just not going to be an issue with, smaller scale farmers. And economically, this has been absolutely devastating for farmers in the prairies. So like the 1980s and 1990s, for example, saw farm net income in Alberta at lows that had not been seen since the Great Depression. So, this is a real crisis in the way agriculture is being done in Alberta. And it was also part of, a larger political strategy on the part of the governing PCs, who at this point had been in government for about 20 years and were about to be in government for 20 more years.
Oh, God.
I know. Really cool place we live, eh?
But yeah, the rural sort of effects are kind of mind-boggling to think about, because in a normal society, if like a giant kind of evil corporation came and just like absorbed all of the market power and political power and really installed itself and ruined your small rural community or whatever, you might be inclined to, I don't know, maybe change to a government that might offer different options as far as your community is concerned. But that's just not what happened in rural Alberta, right?
Well, the PC government had such like a patronage-based style of governing and doing politics, particularly in rural Alberta, that it really discouraged this type of politics, and in particular led to a kind of political de-skilling, which broadly I think we've all experienced, over the past 40 to 50 years with the advent of neoliberalism, but it was especially stark in rural Alberta. And what I mean by political de-skilling is that, the act of doing politics, of being able to talk about politics, of being able to look at the world around you and interpret it politically, of being able to organize your neighbors and your coworkers to do things about it. These are all skills which we only really develop through practice, through failure, through loss, through wins. And if that is not happening, you are going to lose those skills and lose the ability to be effective political actors. And the PCs were really, really good at deliberately robbing people of those skills in rural Alberta through what I would call almost like a patronage form of government, where there was constantly little things, here and there being like gifted to rural Alberta. Of course, this is all like coming from tax revenue, which you could argue that municipalities are owed anyway, because that is how a government works or a society works. But all sorts of community institutions were instituted through patronage, or the arrival of businesses that would employ people in certain communities, that was through patronage. So it encouraged people in rural Alberta to develop really specific relationships with their elected officials that did not include politically confronting them. And as we can see, that's been extremely disastrous for rural Alberta, because what happened is the rural prairie economy became pretty much fully subordinated to the needs of global capital accumulation, and local people were increasingly put beneath the demands of multinational commodity firms. And that is bad, not good.
Quite rather bad. Whenever I think of the PCs dealing with rural Alberta, part of me just can't help but think of the mob. It's kind of like, they install themselves and they set up certain people so that they're successful businesses or whatever, or community leaders or whatever. And then it's kind of like, well, it'd be a shame if something happened to your small business, if you know what I mean. And like,
it's like, oh, it would be a shame if something happened to this industry that employs like 30% of the people who work in your town.
Yeah. Anyhow, so getting back on the globalization in rural Alberta vibe, the concentration of ownership was obviously very strong across the board when it came to agricultural commodities, but particularly so in meatpacking. The Cargill beef plant in High River processes 4,500 head of cattle a day, and alone is responsible for 40% of all Canadian beef processing. That's 1.6 million cattle per year. Together with the JBS plant in Brooks, the vast majority of Canadian beef is processed by two plants that have both had enormous and deadly COVID-19 outbreaks.
So shutdowns and slowdowns caused by the virus have had really wide-ranging impacts on producers who are considering destroying unsold livestock to save feed costs, and consumers are going to face higher beef prices and potential shortages. And it seems obvious that concentrating essential production in just a couple of plants creates these serious vulnerabilities in the food system. But how did we get here? How did we get to just two plants controlling so much of our beef processing? The short answer is that it is extremely profitable to concentrate production in just a few facilities. The Cargill High River plant opened in 1989, a state-of-the-art facility that could process 1,200 cattle per day. And in 1994, the Iowa beef packers purchased the Brooks plant and immediately announced an expansion to it. The plant would have a number of foreign owners after the Iowa beef packers, including the current one's Brazilian-based JBS. And these two plants represented a notable change in the industry structure of beef processing.
So before this, beef processing in Canada mostly consisted of smaller Canadian-owned plants that were distributed across the country in major cities. But by the beginning of about the 21st century, these urban slaughterhouses had mostly closed and processing shifted to fewer, larger, and foreign-owned plants in rural areas. Now, this shift had actually already occurred in the United States starting in the 1960s, and Iowa Beef Packers was really a pioneer of the new model. I want to be careful here that we're not suggesting that centralization in an industry is inherently bad, because I do not think that is necessarily true. Certainly with COVID-19, we have seen the way that this industry in particular has been unable to absorb kind of any shock to its system, but that is not necessarily because of centralization. It is because it is run for profit, and when you run something for profit, it incentivizes you to not have any slack in the system through which you could absorb these types of shocks, like a global pandemic. But I just want to be careful here that we're not suggesting that everything has to be like local and dispersed and decentralized in order to be good. The real issue with this here is the profit motive of these companies and the particularly unique and ruthless way in which they go about conducting business.
Yeah, and there are some sort of technical reasons that pushed the industry towards centralization. And one of the really big ones was the sort of widespread use of refrigeration, where previously at the end of World War II, for example, slaughterhouses would be located in cities, cattle would be moved into cities, butchered, transformed into meat products, and sold right shortly after being processed there. Where once refrigerated transport was available, it made more financial sense to raise the animals, process the animals right close to home, and then the refrigerated products could be moved off to the cities more efficiently. And there are other sort of technical features that lead to the sort of higher efficiency of these mega plants. But as we're going to discover, there are some pretty serious risks that also come with an extremely large processing facility. So turning back to Cargill's High River plant, when it opened, it could slaughter 6,000 cattle a week, and with 410 workers compared to the Canada Packers Winnipeg plant, which moved through 3,000 cows per week with 475 workers. These new plants used capital to reduce labor costs and had innovations like a disassembly line, which was a de-skilling of butchering work. And as a result, the IBP Brooks refused to abide by an industry-wide union master agreement and lowered the wages for the people there. Furthermore, the Brooks plant implemented box beef, which meant that instead of shipping whole carcasses en route to grocery stores and restaurants to butcher, the plant would cut it down to retail specifications, which allowed them to keep additional byproducts and reprocess them in the plant for sale.
Improvements in transportation and communication, coupled with NAFTA abolishing tariffs, meant these new plants could outcompete older Canadian firms in a now integrated North American market. The reason why these plants were built in Alberta is unsurprising. Alberta produces a lot of beef cattle. Between 1984 and 99, the number of cattle increased from 1.1 million to 2.4 million, and Alberta's share of national cattle production went from 47% to 70%. Shipping live cattle to a processing plant is a significant expense, and with reliable refrigeration technology, it's cheaper to locate a plant near the livestock and ship the meat to outside markets. Also, the Tory provincial government did a lot to entice meatpacking companies for rural economic diversification. They used subsidies, low taxes, and anti-worker labor law brought in response to the 1986 gainer strike. And the size of the labor force at these plants requires thousands and means that rural areas usually can't supply enough workers. And the companies source workers from outside, particularly immigrants, with numerous negative impacts for both local communities and workers. The low pay work usually has few knock-on economic benefits for a rural area, while the influx of thousands of new people strains available housing and social services. The nature of the job itself has bad health consequences and puts big demands on rural healthcare. I mean, it's a factory system, an assembly line or disassembly line kind of setup in these plants. So you're doing like repetitive motion things day after day after day, shift after shift, which obviously is not great for just for one's physical health. And many workers will bring their families and existing schools don't have the capacity, especially if immigrant children have extra learning needs such as ESL.
And fortunately, this was all happening right around the time that Ralph Klein's giant austerity hammer was coming down on Alberta. So the already lean social services that existed in this province were being basically stripped away for parts and sold to the highest bidder. So there was even less capacity in our social services and really in our ability to have a society and our ability to care for each other that exacerbated a lot of these issues.
So the Cargill plant's close proximity to Calgary has meant that most of the workforce commutes from the city. So High River hasn't seen as big of an impact as we were just describing with, extra stress on social programs and so on and so on. However, Brooks is almost 200 kilometers from Calgary. So the town has gotten the full spectrum of issues that we've been describing. After the plant expansion was complete in December of 1996, management needed more workers than the local area could provide. So they first tried recruiting from the Atlantic provinces, where the recent collapse of the cod fishery had created severe unemployment, which was over 30% in some places. But they also recruited recent immigrants, particularly from Africa. So by mid-1997, Brooks had a 0% vacancy rate, and the company started to build dormitories for workers as a result of this, with all the paycheck deductions one would expect from company housing. The company wanted the dormitories with their curfews and pass systems to be transitional for workers, so they would also progressively increase rent for the longer that people would stay. So very nice stuff.
And I want to be really clear here in the way that we talk about this, because this new workforce is primarily made up of migrants and is primarily racialized. A lot of the way these issues get discussed are in incredibly racist terms about migrants and particularly Black people and people of color bringing kind of crime and social disorder into rural Alberta. And I want to be really clear in the way that we address these issues, that it is without a doubt 100% not the fault of the workers who are victims of capitalism and of imperialism and of racism that these things happen, but rather of really two systems. One of a government that was enforcing brutal austerity, leaving workforces struggling in poverty, not providing, the bones and the institutions you need to have a society in these places, and the other of companies that, ruthlessly exploited workers in these particular ways. And these negative social consequences, they are the direct result of highly profitable business practices. All of the things we just discussed, these are the reasons that these companies make such large profits. These are the reasons they pull in billions of dollars. These are the reasons that they are able to sustain themselves. They're not two unrelated issues that just happen to be interacting with each other. One happens directly because of the other.
I was just going to say, what a sweet job to set yourself up as not only the employer, but also the landlord for these folks who are being imported in a very vulnerable position. You get to control their entire employment future, typically under the TFW programs here. And you also get to just progressively put the screws to them by increasing their rent until you force them out and replace them with some more workers. Really cleverly thought out way to just extract all possible value from your employees.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's some real company store energy coming from this little detail. I mean, from what I've read, the geared to the rent, so that the rent went up the longer you stayed. It was kind of a disincentive for you to stay there long term, and they were providing short term housing just because of the failure of general market failure to build adequate housing in the area to begin with. Still not a great look though.
I also wanted to comment really briefly on the nature of the job of working in one of these plants, because like we mentioned earlier, it is really difficult work in a whole bunch of ways. Besides just the potential for repetitive stress injury, you're working with knives and grinders and other heavy machinery that can cause injuries. You're moving large animal carcasses around, which can cause stress and can cause damage to your body. You may be responsible for ending the lives of animals, for actually slaughtering them, which comes with all sorts of emotional challenges. It's a very difficult thing to do, and not all workers are actually capable of performing that kind of work over time, just because it is harmful in that sense. And also, some workers are exposed to partially digested or fully digested food inside these animals because, of course, before they arrive at these plants, they're alive. And so you are exposed to blood, you're exposed to fecal matter, you're exposed to all sorts of potentially infectious stuff. And you're doing all this in extremely close quarters with extremely high volumes from all machinery going on. It sounds like an extremely stressful and incredibly difficult work environment. And all of that contributes to the healthcare needs that any population doing this sort of job is going to require. And the intensification of work, of course, only makes all of those features more difficult, only increases the impacts that they have on the workers.
In the mid-1990s, Alberta Beef recruited workers from Atlantic Canada, ex-cod fishers and others to work in the plants. But turnover was high, worksite conditions were poor, and housing unavailable. So many returned to the East Coast, and many told their families what it was like to work there. And for some reason, interprovincial migration to do those jobs just dropped dramatically. Alberta's attempt to diversify away from raw resources meant attracting global agricultural firms to Alberta. A national contract for the whole industry determined meatpacking wages from 1947 to 1984. Essentially, what you saw after these companies moved from urban centers to rural Alberta was de-skilling of the work involved. And these unskilled categorizations for the work meant that workers now earned far less than they did proportionally compared to their counterparts in the mid-20th century.
The way in which labor becomes unskilled, and I'm making a lot of air quotes with my fingers right now, it often occurs in tandem with the processes of the racialization of the workforce. And we see this in meatpacking, and we just released an episode on long-term care. We see this in healthcare as well, whereas more and more racialized people begin participating in the workforce and begin participating in certain types of jobs, that work becomes devalued. In healthcare, it literally becomes devalued through creating, new categories of healthcare workers, like licensed practical nurses, in order to lower people's wages and put downward pressure on wages. And the same thing, really happens in meatpacking, where this idea that the labor is unskilled and therefore deserves unskilled wages comes with the entry of more and more racialized people into the workforce.
What's really interesting about this migration pattern, all these workers coming to a small community, and kind of like insufficient investments in the social infrastructure needed to support people as far as like education, health, any number of things, social services. It reminds me a little bit of like the similar rush that happened in like Fort McMurray, where when the oil prices were red hot, Fort McMurray was absolutely like swamped with people seeking paychecks because the labor market was so tight. But like there was no housing, there was like very little amenities for people to actually be able to spend their money. There was very little infrastructure. And you even had like the mayor of Fort McMurray at the time complaining about how overheated the economy was and wishing that it would calm down a bit so that they could try to deal with what was going on rather than just having the number of people increase.
Something else that I find quite telling is just that in the midst of the cod fishery closure, we had all these folks, Canadian workers who are unemployed, who decided to give this sector a try, and they found the conditions to be too terrible to work in that they decided to try and work somewhere else. So it's quite telling to me that in order to find people who could be compelled to work or who would tolerate working in these sorts of environments, we had to turn for temporary foreign workers who could be placed under all sorts of other pressures to put up and tolerate these work environments when no one else would.
And by interesting, whenever we say interesting on this podcast, we mean, this is extremely
horrific.
Upsetting. Yeah.
Grimly interesting.
Just to be clear.
There's also a fair amount of labor action that happened at these plants. In 1995, Brooks, having seen this wave of immigration, was basically like starting to recruit very heavily.
And once again, I strongly recommend a National Film Board documentary, in this case, 24 Days in Brooks, which is about the 2005 strike at the then Lakeside Packers meatpacking plant in Brooks, Alberta. That was basically a strike over union recognition in the plan. It is a very, very interesting documentary, and it goes over a a lot of some frankly really wild things that were happening in labor disputes in Alberta in the 21st century. Like, we were all alive when this was happening.
So it's a fantastic little documentary. It's only about 45 minutes long, and it really gives you a very good overview of this 2005 strike effort that happened at Brooks. What the documentary doesn't talk about is like some of the earlier unionization efforts that happened throughout the like mid to late 90s up until that point. But there's just some wild stuff that happened in 2005 in Brooks.
There was a fucking car chase. Like the president of the union, Doug O'Halloran, was driven off the road by the CEO of Lakeside, among other top guys with Lakeside. It's like it was freaking crazy.
There was a literal car chase. And it's really interesting because you get a really clear sense of a lot of the dynamics that existed in these meatpacking plants. So, as we've gone over, this is not a pleasant job. There is a lot of poor treatment of workers, firing injured workers, no washroom breaks, things like that. It is work that is accident prone, injury prone. It is repetitive. It is bloody. It is difficult. And it also goes into the way that even within the workforce, there was basically a caste system in terms of race, in terms of who did what jobs. So, it was disproportionately immigrant workers who had the worst jobs on the killing floor, and disproportionately white workers who had jobs as clerical workers or maintenance staff. And this really comes out in this particular strike in 2005, where, a lot of the strike leaders are migrants. One of the main strike leaders is Sudanese. Many of the line workers who are people of color are supporting the walkout, and the mostly white clerical and maintenance staff are crossing this picket line, like trying to get the union decertified. And there was really violent confrontations that were taking place between picketers and strike breakers, despite, I guess, the presence of the RCMP. But I think knowing what we know of the RCMP's function in perpetuating, capitalism and colonialism, it doesn't come, as much of a surprise. And one of the particularly interesting ways that this plays out is that if you've ever been on a picket line before, you'll know that the police and like the mainstream media love to trump up like really outrageous claims of like violence on picket lines or like union thugs. And then in this particular strike in Brooks, this takes on an extremely racialized dimension because there's this deeply racist idea of, African migrants bringing disorder and violence into this like previously majority white community in rural Alberta. And it was interesting to me to see how neatly this was paired by, Lakeside Packers with these very traditional, like anti-labor, anti-union ideas of unions as like undemocratic and violent, and how they were used to kind of really exert pressure on the strike. Fortunately, on the 24th day of the strike, there was a workplace-wide vote on unionizing, and they narrowly won an agreement.
Going off of Kate's point there, too, there's also another kind of racialized spinning of the coverage of the strike, where there was also a lot of rhetoric that was kind of victimizing these racialized minority workers, where they were demonizing the union and kind of framing it like the union kind of preys on these brand new immigrants that are just trying to come to Canada and provide for their families, and they, that they don't know what's good for them, or that the union is preying on their insecurities. And it's like, it's quite astonishing. It's interesting in the bad way.
Yeah, there's two things going on here. One is the idea that, like the workers and the union are two different things. Like this idea that, the union is like a third party rather than the expression of workers and collective struggle. And then also this like very racist, infantilizing idea of like these workers don't know what's best for themselves, and they're being taken advantage of and manipulated by the union, rather than what was certainly happening is, people who were extremely oppressed coming together and fighting to improve their lives in a really immense struggle with a lot of things against them, which is actually, incredibly remarkable and inspiring.
Yeah, that characterization is just so gross because it's like, first of all, the union is somehow like an outside agitator or whatever. And secondly, these new workers are just like empty-minded worker shells that are like, will just do the first thing you tell them or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's like anti-communist propaganda against unions meets like racist infantilizing ideas about immigrants, which are two bad tastes that taste bad together.
Just absolutely dripping ideology.
Yeah. So when thinking about the working conditions and the labor conditions in these plants, ultimately we have to start thinking and talking about the temporary foreign worker program and immigrant labor, and also Jason Kenney's role in kind of shaping that program. A quick look at the temporary foreign worker program is its origins are in 1973. A majority of TFWs were high-skill employees, engineers, professors, specialist doctors, with the remainder being domestic and agricultural jobs. But slowly that program shifts. 2002, a change creates a new low-skilled worker category. In 2006, a change created a fast-track category for some jobs, which came with lower standards for providing that there weren't enough Canadian residents to do that work in the first place, which is supposedly the rationale for bringing in TFWs. And then a change in 2012 allows employers to pay temporary foreign workers 15% less than a Canadian doing the same work. And this all happened largely during the Harper administration, and a lot of it happened with Jason Kenney as the federal immigration minister. And it's quite strange when you look at the history of the program, because up until about 2014, they were huge boosters of the program. And then in 2014, there was a bit of a scandal with the temporary foreign worker program. If I recall correctly, it had to do with some McDonald's locations in Victoria, BC, where a job got posted and someone local applied for it and never got a call back. And then the McDonald's chain went ahead and hired a bunch of temporary foreign workers, and then that became the basis for kind of creating a scandal about the program.
As a consequence of these reforms to the TFW program, in 2002, we had 100,000 TFWs working in Canada. By 2012, 10 years later, we are up to 338,000 TFWs. The government makes it challenging to get timely information about how many TFWs are currently working in Canada, but we do know that 84,000 TFW permits were issued in 2018, which is up a tick from 78,000 some in 2017. And permits are good for several years, so there are several, the last few years worth of permits represent people who are probably still in the country working. And what's increasingly happened on the labor side is that the tests that were meant to be followed, that you have to get an opinion to prove that there aren't enough Canadians willing or able to do the work that you're bringing in TFWs to perform, those tests got weakened and slackened. And increasingly, the labor market, particularly for jobs like agricultural workers and meat packers, they became basically addicted to the availability of extremely or relatively low cost work, and workers who had relatively limited ability to exercise their rights. One of the important features of TFWs is that their residency in Canada is tied to their employer. They only get to stay here as long as their bosses want them to be here. And this has an incredibly chilling effect on their ability to exercise the rights that anyone with residence in Canada would expect to be able to exercise. So one more fun feature of the TFW program is that usually only workers considered high-skilled or working in the trades actually have a path to permanent residence as a TFW. Our current government has a trial program that will allow a small slice of agricultural workers to become permanent residents, including some meatpacking workers. But this is a very modern innovation and has not been part of the TFW program for most of its life.
And this is actually a place where unions can do some really remarkable work for temporary foreign workers. I happen to know that in the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 401 agreement with Cargill, they have it that Cargill must put forth all temporary foreign workers as basically for entrance into the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program as soon as possible, but no later than 6 months after each candidate's arrival in Canada. So they've basically got in writing with some teeth to it in a collective agreement that basically anyone that Cargill brings to this country to work in one of their meatpacking plants must be put into the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. And I think that is really quite a remarkable win to have in writing in a collective agreement.
It's also a remarkable illustration of the power that employers have in this situation, where it's only at the employer's say-so that a TFW actually can enter into a program that lets them establish permanent residence.
Yeah, we'll get into some things we think need to be done later, but there needs to be a guaranteed path to citizenship for all temporary foreign workers. If you're good enough to work in Canada, you are good enough to live in Canada from the day you arrive, period, end of, not up for negotiation. It shouldn't be something that unions like UFCW have to go to the table and fight tooth and nail for. It should be a right.
Yeah, and I mean, just taking a quick look at the temporary foreign worker program, it seems like a very obvious way of manipulating the labor market to prevent wages from creeping up. When you look at when it was implemented and when it was really quote unquote needed, it mostly had to do with like the economy heating up because of the high price of oil and the oil sands, basically, and their like red hot development. So basically to prevent labor shortages / to prevent wages from going up, this program was introduced so that they could siphon labor in, but not have the, this is cynical, but quote unquote costs associated with like bringing in labor, which is like giving them citizenship rights, giving them the right to vote, giving them all the rights that a citizen might have when they work in this country. So it's a way of getting the work out of them without the same commitments of citizenship.
It is truly disgusting.
And I'd really like to stress how the incredible brutal nature of meatpacking jobs goes hand in hand with the incredible power that the employer gets to have over its workers. There's a reason why a lot of people who have, reason why people who want to exercise a certain amount of dignity choose not to take these jobs, even if they are available, and why only a person who is, compelled to work on the threat of deportation actually will tolerate working at our meatpacking plants. It's remarkable.
Bringing this sort of lens of temporary foreign workers to bear on the meatpacking industry, at the Lakeside plant in Brooks, after the 2005 strike and the unionization vote, the company turned to temporary foreign workers. In 2006, Lakeside announced that they were bringing 250 TFWs to Brooks from China, the Philippines, Ukraine, and El Salvador. Starting pay in 2006 was $14 an hour, which is about $17 an hour in our current dollars, which is half of what the inflation-adjusted wage was for equivalent work in 1984. Hundreds more temporary foreign workers were recruited. As of 2008, 775 TFWs were working in Brooks, mostly at Lakeside. In 2009, Lakeside was sold to XL Foods, a division of Edmonton-based Nielsen Brothers. XL Foods expanded the recruitment of TFWs, adding workers from Mexico and Colombia to its labor force. And by 2011, temporary foreign workers comprised about 1/3 of the plant's labor force. Immigrants and refugees already accounted for about 60% of the labor force by 2006.
Workers under Canada's temporary foreign worker program can't change jobs, and they can't bring their families with them. They're allowed to stay in Canada for up to 4 years. When their contract expires, companies can nominate the workers for permanent residency, but that's only if the company so chooses. So the company here holds an incredible amount of power over this temporary worker's life and livelihood.
Unless, of course, you are a worker who belongs to a union that has been able to negotiate this through remarkable organization and struggle. But of course, when you negotiate it, that is something that comes up and you have to fight over every single time you go to the bargaining table, which might be every 2, 3, 4 years. So it is something that is, of course, absolutely remarkable to win, but also something that is tenuous.
In 2014, Canada's meat industry loudly complained about difficulties in getting temporary foreign workers hired. You'll recall that the oil price boom created tight labor market conditions throughout the 2000s up until the price of oil sank in late 2014. The temporary foreign worker program has been very important to both of these meatpacking plants as far as staffing them, as far as maintaining a steady supply of labor that was relatively docile or that was relatively easy to manipulate. And so these plants were out in rural Alberta in the first place because they were trying to avoid the problems with labor organizing that urban-based plants had encountered in the 80s.
And now to change track a bit from our largely worker-focused episode, I think it is worth it to talk about the real villains in this whole story, and that is Cargill and JBS. And I'm not using villains in a flippant or ironic way. These are corporations that are truly monstrous and truly evil. They have gotten thousands of workers sick during a pandemic because they refuse to put people before profits. And they have caused the death of several workers already in Alberta, let alone in other places. They are truly monstrous, truly evil, truly villainous, and I think it is worth learning a little bit more about them and about the particularities of the way they operate and what makes them just so bad.
So yeah, Cargill been literally called the worst company in the world, and we'll find out shortly why. They're a Minnesota-based agribusiness giant. They're actually the biggest privately owned company in the U.S. And just to get a sense of that, they surpass even the Koch brothers. And their record in just about every domain is terrible, whether it be the environment, treatment of Indigenous peoples, poverty, health and safety, child labor, you name it. And it goes back to almost their entire existence. So just to start off, Cargill had its membership from the Chicago Board of Trade revoked for trying to corner the market on corn, artificially driving up corn prices shortly after their incorporation about 80 years ago. And then more recently, Cargill was fined $10 million by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission for, yet again, misreporting trade values. And on another front, in 2018, Cargill distributed over 70 tons of contaminated beef to markets. On the environmental front, Cargill has a long history of clear-cutting forests, decimating ecosystems, which produces a lot of carbon emissions. These practices actually account for 10% of total global emissions. And this is a multinational endeavor. Cargill is very active in South America, and so this is especially dangerous when you take into account the fact that they have a lot of operations in places like Brazil, who just elected Jair Bolsonaro, who has vowed to abandon conservation efforts of the Amazon. And so quite similarly to what has happened more locally, this environmental degradation, these human rights abuses are the result of political decisions. So Cargill is one of the top perpetrators of deforestation in South America, as I was mentioning, and much of this is for soy production, which is then used for feeding livestock. And very interestingly, just to put this into perspective, more than 3/4 of the world's soy production is actually used for this purpose of feeding livestock. And this has also been accompanied with pushing Indigenous people off their traditional lands. And there have been reports after reports when this has happened of these Indigenous communities reporting serious health issues due to the pesticides and herbicides used. Cargill is also involved with the production and importing of cocoa and is one of the 3 companies that control more than half of the global trade. And so this has also entailed huge amounts of deforestation, near extermination of animal life, especially in West Africa where this is produced. So we're really getting all across the globe here. So Cargill has also repeatedly knowingly benefited from and purchased cocoa produced through brutal child labor and exploitation, over which suits have been filed against them by the International Labor Rights Fund. They also are one of the largest importers and exporters of palm oil, which again has been accompanied by massive destruction of tropical rainforests, expropriation of indigenous lands, again, child labor and trafficking, and this has been especially the case in Southeast Asia. More locally, Cargill is the second largest feed beef processor in North America and the largest supplier of ground beef. And it's important to remember here too that meat production is one of the most environmentally destructive industries in the world. And then, as we kind of mentioned before, their safety standards have not been up to par either. Leading up to their massive E. coli outbreak in 2007, federal investigators in the United States repeatedly found that Cargill was violating its safety measures in its handling of ground beef. So you also have their negligence actively putting people in danger in that regard as well. So pretty evil stuff.
I think this is a really interesting example of a phrase that sometimes gets thrown around of like colonialism at home and abroad, or imperialism like at home and abroad, where we see like the exact same social factors that are, destroying the land and the environment in so-called Canada, that are destroying the lives of racialized workers in Canada, are doing the same things to other colonized and oppressed peoples abroad. And I think it is a really illuminating and evocative example of how, capital is internationalist, and why our struggle against capital must also kind of transcend borders, because they're not only doing this here, they're doing this in other places.
Yeah, and it turns out that JBS is also not a great company. They're most famous perhaps for corruption accusations. There was a handing over of $150,000 in bribery money in Brazil and Operation Car Wash. So you can read up about that if you really want to get into it. There's also an industry-wide scandal about the sale of rotten beef that they were involved in, slave labor allegations, specifically about their operations in Brazil, where they were forcing men to live in conditions described as inhumane and degrading with inadequate shelter, toilets, or drinking water. Incidents of animal cruelty, price fixing, deforestation. Yeah, there's a lot there. So not a great organization, in my humble opinion.
I wanted to touch on the sort of larger economic impacts that these mega corporations producing our meat have kind of had. The United States and Canadian meatpacking industries are tightly integrated. There's a lot of flow of animals and products across the border. And so a lot of what applies in Canada also applies to American companies. And the major mega corporations are names like Cargill, Tyson, Purdue, and JBS. When it comes to cattle in particular, there's basically 3 stages that the animals go through. There's a growing phase where growers start the animals. They move to a feedlot phase where the animals are fed really high, really energy intensive foods, really protein intensive food to fatten them up. And then there's a slaughter step. And the feedlot phase is a big center for a lot of the pollution and a lot of the disease risk in the meatpacking sector today. And it's only possible because these animals are medicated with antibiotics. It's the only possible way for large numbers of cattle to be grown and kept on a single feedlot together without infections just ripping through the entire herd. So these mega corporations manage to capture an awful lot of value, in part because there's so little competition. There's been so much consolidation that growers will get 1, maybe 2 offers from different corporations when they are ready to sell their animals from the grower phase to the feedlot phase of the industry. And that's where a lot of value is captured by these huge corporations. And we've also discussed in at great length how a lot of value is also captured by intensifying the production and placing workers in very precarious positions to work really, really hard in the slaughterhouse phase in particular. Of course, because there's a very small number of corporations doing all this work, one of the other fun consequences is that the cost savings of producing meat very efficiently don't actually necessarily get passed on to the consumer. Again, because the grocery stores have to deal with a very small number of very large corporations producing the large bulk of our meat. A lot of the efficiency that has been achieved by these corporations just gets captured by them. And that's how these mega corporations can be so incredibly profitable.
Not great. I hate it. So we've gone through so far the shift in production from urban centers to rural Alberta, the accompanying increase in scale and the kind of speed up and the kind of assembly line or disassembly line process that's involved in the new plants, the integration of this particular kind of industry into big agricultural industries in general, and how they all are operating on enormous scales and also are incredibly vertically integrated. We've also talked a fair bit about labor struggle and the use of status and the use of precarious labor, primarily through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, in order to keep wages low and promote a kind of docile or less likely to organize or protest workforce. So given all that and the kind of picture we've painted of the industry and what's going on, how could we possibly start moving towards making things better when it comes to this industry?
I said this earlier on the episode, but there has to be guaranteed paths to citizenship for temporary foreign workers. anyone who is good enough to work in Canada should be good enough to live in Canada. From the very second that a company or a government brings you to Canada to work, you should be eligible to live in Canada for the rest of your life. No negotiations, and you should be able to bring your family with you. That is an absolute non-starter and an absolute non-negotiable for me, because otherwise you are creating a class of people in Canada who are uniquely oppressed and uniquely vulnerable to being exploited by their employers, which is not only bad for the people who are experiencing that oppression, but is also bad for our society in general, because it erodes the conditions of workers who are born in Canada or who have permanent residence in Canada, and it erodes our ability to organize temporary foreign workers, and it also erodes everyone's wages. It is a no-win situation for everyone who works for a living, and the only people who benefit off of it are governments like Jason Kenney's and companies like Cargill and JBS.
Something else that would help a lot would be to have regulated caps on plant sizes, on slaughterhouse sizes. No more 500,000 or million head per year plants where disease can spread really rapidly on workers, as we've seen with COVID-19, and where we've also seen that any contamination problem with the products that are being created in these plants can affect really huge batches of meat.
Another really important thing that we need to look at is line speed. So line speed is basically referring to the pace and the rate of work that occurs in meatpacking plants. And the high pace of work in these plants is a huge part of what makes them efficient, but it also leads to repetitive stress injuries, exposure to infectious material from animals, and higher rates of injury from knives and machinery. And one thing that's really interesting here is we talked about national pattern bargaining earlier in the episode when it came to the gainers strike. A really similar thing happens here with line speed, in that no company will touch line speed in a collective agreement. And the reason that no company will touch line speed in a collective agreement is because they all have a hell of a lot of class solidarity with each other. And they realize that as soon as you put anything in writing in a collective agreement with regards to having union and worker control over line speed, that becomes a point of negotiation every single time you go to the bargaining table. And B, when you go into these formal labor processes of arbitration or mediation over collective agreements, oftentimes what those processes do is they look at the status quo and they look at other agreements, and then they just give people what is in those agreements. So it's something that they want completely off the table, and so far, to the best of my knowledge, have been really successful in keeping off the table. We recently did an episode on long-term care where a lot of the similar dynamics that we've discussed here with regards to precarity and the workforce exist in the same way. And a similar thing with regards to line speed exists in long-term care when it comes to staffing ratios, as this is something that is overall the underpinning structure of your entire workday and your entire experience as a worker is, how many staff you have to do things in long-term care and how fast that line is moving in meatpacking. But it's something that companies are so resistant to touch, and they really are going to have to be forced to through incredibly powerful workers' organizations. Otherwise, that is never going to get on the table and get in writing. So union mandated line speed limits. Failing that, I guess the government, a benevolent social democratic government, could regulate it. But I personally think that is unlikely. And of course, any win that is won through struggle from below is much more likely to be durable in the long run, pending a change in government.
What's so interesting about the line speed question as well is that the speed of production is quite intricately linked to the profit rate, like the number of cows you can slaughter, the number of the sheer amount of beef you can produce and get out the door within a given day or shift or hour is literally how will determine the profit margin in a large part. And it also determines how shitty it is to work there that day or not.
It is literally
right?
the mechanism that is extracting profit from these workers.
Precisely.
So yeah, shrinking plants and reducing the pace of work, likely to make meat slightly more expensive, but That's simply the price of safer workspaces, safer food supply. We should pay it gladly. And, the cost of not taking these steps, as it turns out, are like horrifically high, as we've seen with COVID, and as we also see with, things like listeria outbreaks that aren't properly controlled.
And just to add to that, like the profits are not being, the gains in efficiency, if you want to call it that, from these line speed ups and from this whole production process, they're not going into delivering like the cheapest product possible to consumers. They're going to profits, right? So it's not even like these costs would necessarily be borne by consumers. They might just result in a lower rate of profit.
Yeah, and that ties into another one of our recommendations, which is to break up the big agricultural megacorporations. They extract value on the bottom end from putting the squeeze on people who supply them with animals and putting the squeeze on the workers. They extract value from us by not passing the savings on when they produce meat incredibly efficiently on the shelves. And it's only because we've allowed these companies to consolidate and become really monstrously large international corporations.
Pat, I have an idea. We don't even have to break them up. It should simply be considered immoral in our society to make profit off of providing others with food, and workers should run these plants.
I like it. This is a good plan. We should go somewhere with this.
You don't say.
I know you're trying to be realistic, Patrick. I just,
No, you're absolutely right.
It's our podcast. I can say nationalize meatpacking if I want.
And they have conveniently consolidated all of their resources in just a couple of mega corporations, making the nationalization easier to organize.
More and more people are saying this. It would piss off like 3 families.
The last point, and this is a slightly more technocratic one, would be to ban the routine use of antibiotics in animals. We haven't really begun to dig into the issues with like our industrial food production system. That would be an entirely different episode. But the consequence of using antibiotics are the only reason why extremely large scale feedlots are possible to be used. And so this one regulatory change would actually have quite a lot of knock-on effects in terms of the industry being forced to operate in slightly safer ways. And, not using antibiotics in animals means that their effectiveness will be extended for use in humans, which I would suggest is a much more important use of a finite and shared resource.
So to begin to wrap up this episode, it's worth mentioning a few organizations that are doing very good work on a lot of these fronts. First of all, it's worth mentioning Migrante and Action Dignity, which are 2 very good organizations working on this issue. We had a mini episode that featured a spokesperson from Migrante about healthcare for all, which I recommend everybody listen to.
The other group or organization that has really been at the forefront of responding to these outbreaks at meatpacking plants in Alberta has been the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 401, which is the union that represents workers at both JBS in Brooks and at Cargill in High River. And they have been able to do some pretty remarkable things in terms of winning pandemic pay and hazard pay for their members. They have been outside the plant at Cargill in High River this past week, handing out PPE, information on right to refuse unsafe work to members who are still going to work at Cargill, which reopened quite recently. But I also think some of the things that we have seen with the UFCW Local 401 have really shown the limitations of their approach to this issue and perhaps to trade unionism more generally, in that they haven't been able to enforce real consequences on Cargill. And there are 3 deaths connected to the Cargill plant, 2 of them being workers from the plant, 1 of them being the father of a worker from that plant. Yes, the plant was closed temporarily, but when they wanted to reopen it, and the union did a poll saying that 85% of workers were scared to return to work, they were unable to actually get the plant closed. I think there's a couple things here. One is the trade union movement's general over-reliance on legal mechanisms. These are things like the Alberta Labor Relations Board, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, anything that goes to grievance or arbitration, a bunch of extremely boring words. And the reason that these things so often don't work for workers is that labor law is really stacked against us. Labor law isn't designed to give workers like you and me a fair playing field on which to fight the boss. Labor law is designed to allow the boss to effectively, neuter and restrict the ability of workers' organizations to express power collectively on the work site. So, you are always going to lose when you play by their rule book. The other kind of frustrating thing that I tend to hear a lot about this is like, well, like we have to take direction from our members on this issue. And obviously, I'm a really big believer in member-driven grassroots unions. But at a fundamental level, it is your job as a union organizer or a union rep to show people the connections between what they want and actions you are asking them to take. Because the fact is that most people don't experience problems at work and think, oh, I should go on strike, or, oh, we should blockade the gates to our workplace so no one can get in. And that's because, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, people have been really politically de-skilled. This is something that very few people, even workers who are in unions, have any type of experience with in their lives. So it's not something they're going to feel comfortable doing. And it is the job of trade unions and of the staffers who work for trade unions who are relatively protected and insulated from the pressures that these workers on the work sites are feeling to do that work and to make the link there between what workers are experiencing and what can be done about it. And the last thing I think that is a really important lesson for me looking at this and looking about how I think, honestly, like weak in many ways, the trade union movement came looking from this and what a serious blow was struck to it is that you can't wait until a crisis to organize workers. You have to get organized and you have to stay organized. So when a crisis like this happens, you already have robust shop floor organization and robust workers committees who can take advantage of these situations rather than trying to do all that legwork once a crisis has happened. Because, like, you know, of course you can't organize a major job action in 3 weeks, which is why, you know, you shouldn't try. You should be prepared to do that on a regular basis. And I think one of my frustrations with, you know, how UFCW has reacted to this is we know this is a plant that has the capacity, I'm talking about Cargill here, to be very, very well organized. You know, this is a plant that has taken strike votes before, that has been very aggressive in bargaining, that has won really incredible things in their contract. At JBS, you know, they had that magnificent strike in 2005. Like, we know these are places where workers can be organized, can, you know, flex on the boss, but it was a little bit of a missed opportunity here. And I think there's some very real lessons for the trade union movement going forward.
And just to end the episode, I think it's worth actually naming and remembering several of the workers who have died due to this pandemic in meatpacking plants in Alberta. Let's take a moment to remember Briti Hiep, age 67, Armando Salega, 71, father of a worker, Benito Quesada, 51, shop steward, and the unnamed JBS worker whose name has not been released.
So it turns out that the more you look into meatpacking, the worse it gets. It is like a terrible box that you keep opening, and every layer that you open turns out to be worse and worse. So, you know, you have this incredibly cruel and environmentally destructive industry, and you open it to look at the working conditions, and it turns out those are awful. And then you look past the working conditions to see the impact of this industry on rural prairie communities, and it turns out that is awful. And then you look past that to see what kind of companies and actors are involved in meatpacking, and oh, it turns out they're all awful villains. So it really is just a terrible, like, unfolding box / onion of absolute horrors. So to end the episode, I would like to go around the table and have everyone name for me one of the worst, most upsetting things you learned about meatpacking from researching this episode.
My personal least favorite fact was that they avoided unionization and like a fight for fair working conditions in urban centers by creating a whole new set of labor conditions and labor market outside of urban centers. That to me was just like, wow, the lengths they will go to just avoid paying people well is impressive.
I learned that at the Cargill plant, the pace of work for workers who are cutting up parts of animals is so high that workers who have to hold a knife all day will begin to see their fingertips turn black because they just have to have such a tight grip on this knife for hours at a time. And this is apparently just a normal problem that happens to a lot of workers who do this particular type of work. And it's just a feature of their job. There's little they can do about it.
Awful.
Yeah, and I think one of the shocking or terrible things I learned was when I was learning, doing some of the research about the Lakeside Packers strike and the working conditions there in Brooks in 2005. There were reports of workers being told not to go to the hospital when they were injured, of Lakeside firing injured workers, which we can only imagine because we were talking about the precarity of temporary foreign workers, which presumably some of these workers were. And also things as awful as not allowing washroom breaks and workers literally peeing their own pants. Like it was awful conditions that seems to be quite normal across the industry.
Yeah, one thing that I knew going into this, but that doing all of the research really brought home how cruel all of this was, is, forcing people to work in these conditions under the threat of deportation if they leave their jobs, which makes it incredibly difficult, for these workers to organize and to fight back. And it really profoundly humbled me when I looked at the history of meatpacking in Alberta, and I saw how much workers had risked at places like Cargill and at places like JBS to form unions and to sit at the bargaining table with their employer. And it was very impressive to me, but also incredibly sobering what great risks they were taking, and how there is an entire, second class of labor that exists in this country, solely to drive down conditions for everyone and exploit people. So I wish I had a better, happier note on which to end this episode, but the truth of the matter is that it is an incredibly upsetting topic that only gets more upsetting the more and more you learn about it. And I hope that this episode has been illuminating, if not particularly pleasant listening for all of you out there in Alberta. Take care out there, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Makes no difference where I go, you're the best hometown I know. Hello, Calgary, you know we love you.
The Alberta Advantage is part of a loose affiliation of left-wing podcasts hosted by the bilingual journalism collective Ricochet, who you can find at ricochet.media. Our podcast is primarily supported through Patreon by listeners like you. We use the money for equipment and other semi-serious pursuits. And as a thank you, we send out fun packages with grain elevator themed stickers and weird tote bags a couple times a year. You can support us at patreon.com/Alberta Advantage. Thanks so much for listening, and take care out there.
Hometown,